Hello and welcome to the sixth session of the Green Horizon Summit, when we are focusing on nature and nature-related risk. We are making some progress, I believe, on the issue of energy, clean energy, renewables, part of the revolution in the way that people are thinking about climate. We have yet to reach that level of understanding with nature and biodiversity loss. Today we're going to bring together many of the initiatives that are already appearing in this area to try and make sense of them from a financial markets perspective. Firstly, we will hear from Lord Zach Goldsmith and UNEP Chief Inger Anderson, who will make the case for this study that we're doing here. Secondly, we have a panel who will look at the many initiatives that are coming and how we can put them together into a framework that makes sense to the financial community. Thirdly, we have a very exciting presentation on carbon offset markets, which will be making, I believe, some very important proposals. And fourthly, we have a conversation with Professor Partha Dasgupta, a leading light on the economics of biodiversity loss.
Thank you, Roger. Though I can't join you live today, I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to you. Were it not for the pandemic, today we'd likely be reflecting on the closing of the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming, and we'd be welcoming the world to the climate conference in Glasgow. And that all seems like a different age now. And in many respects, it is. Coronavirus is itself very likely the consequence of our abuse of nature, but we know it will be dwarfed by the impacts of environmental degradation and climate breakdown. Populations of key species have declined by more than 2/3 in my lifetime alone. Around 1 million species currently face extinction. 2 out of every 5 species of plants are now threatened, twice what we thought just 4 years ago. We've brought the world's great fisheries to their knees, to the brink in most cases, and are destroying the world's tropical forests at a rate of 30 football pitches every single minute. We're losing wonders of the world, medicines, foods, and materials of the future. Now, this ecological catastrophe is an economic calamity as well. 1 billion people depend on fish for protein. Around 1 billion people depend directly on forests, including many indigenous people. Invariably, the world's poorest people are hit hardest when the free but hopelessly undervalued services that nature provides begin to fail. But clearly all of us depend fundamentally on the natural world that we inhabit. And whether you turn to the Dasgupta Review on the economics of biodiversity, the Global Commission on Adaptation, or Swiss Re's latest resilience ranking, the news is bleak. For the first time in its 15-year history, the top 5 places of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report were filled by environmental risks. So for the sake of people and the planet, turning this trajectory around is objectively the principal challenge of our age. Now, tragically, over 1 million people have been killed and every single economy battered by this pandemic. But if there's a silver lining to this appalling experience, it's an opportunity to use the urgent need and considerable funds for economic recovery to build back better, greener, and cleaner, to do things differently. Now, clearly that's not just another box to tick. It means making sustainability and resilience the lens through which we map out every decision in our recovery. Now, to some extent, that's already happening in relation to carbon. The cost of renewables has tumbled. Zero-emissions vehicles are right on the cusp of going mainstream. The market, in so many respects, is racing ahead of the politics, sometimes in spite of the politics. You consider that coal use in the US fell faster under Trump than it did under Obama. So in December, the UK, alongside France and the UN, will be hosting an ambition summit in partnership with Italy and Chile, and asking countries who want to join us to announce new commitments on long-term strategies to meet zero targets, on adaptation plans, and to mobilize at least $100 billion a year for developing countries. But when it comes to attaching a value to nature and a cost to its destruction, we have a very, very long way to go, and that has to change. There is no pathway to tackling climate change or indeed preventing poverty and reversing appalling biodiversity loss that does not involve protecting and conserving nature on a massive, unprecedented scale. Nature-based solutions could provide a third of the solution we need to climate change, but it receives less than 3% of the international climate finance. And we've committed not only to doubling our climate finance, but to increasing the share that is spent on nature-based solutions significantly. And we're encouraging others to do similarly. But the task is far too big for public money alone, so we need to mobilize private finance as well. And we need to identify and shift the incentives that drive destruction. The $700 billion in agricultural subsidies paid out by the top 50 food-producing countries, for instance. And we're working with the private sector to devise systems for understanding better environmental risks. Through the creation of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was chaired by Michael Bloomberg and championed by Mark Carney, we are beginning to understand the risks associated with carbon emissions. And we now need the same global effort for nature. But natural systems are vastly more complex than measuring carbon. And nature-related risks go far beyond climate alone. For example, the risk of flooding increases dramatically with the loss of wetlands and the removal of forests. Food production depends completely on the healthy soils that we are despoiling. So the finance sector struggles to understand environmental risk, and that's why the UK government is working closely with the UN and Global Canopy, WWF, and a working group of financial institutions, governments, and regulators from all around the world to create a market-led task force for nature-related financial disclosures. The market is the most powerful force for change, other than nature herself. But until it applies value to nature and cost to its destruction, that power will continue to drive destruction. And that is perhaps the single biggest challenge we now face. But facing it isn't merely a choice, it is a duty. But with indisputable facts combined with the need for economic recovery all around the world, and a year in which the world will be gathering to address all these crises together, we have a unique opportunity to turn the tide. So I want to thank you for what you do and wish you well.
Let me begin by thanking the City of London Corporation and the Green Finance Institute, as well as the World Economic Forum, for organizing this forum as part of a critical effort to build momentum on green finance. The COVID-19 pandemic has driven home how exposed to risk our economies and societies are. Risks that those of us working in the environmental field have been calling out for years now. At UNEP, we speak of three planetary crises: the climate crisis, the nature and biodiversity crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. These crises are destroying the natural world upon which our economies and societies are built. They're driven by decades of unsustainable consumption and production. We humans have altered 75% of the terrestrial surface of our planet, and we risk losing 1 million species out of 7.8 unless we take action. Climate change continues unabated. The science is clear, and yet we remain unprepared for the shocks associated with these crises. Now, as we continue to deal with COVID-19, we must act harder and faster on the commitments already made. We must make further commitments and take real and meaningful action to stabilize the climate, to protect our natural world, and to stop pollution. Real and meaningful action means moving investment flows away from unsustainable consumption and production patterns. No more financing of coal, deforestation-free food, feed, and fiber, a regulatory framework that limits pollution and protects the climate and nature. And all of this requires investment. All of this requires shifting gear in the finance sector, both public and private. The initial stimulus packages in response to COVID-19 rightly prioritized health and keeping companies and people afloat. Now we must look to the future. Over the next 6 to 18 months, a further $20 trillion in stimulus is likely, largely based on government borrowing. Never before have we seen this amount of public resources being pumped into the economy. We're doing this to save jobs and to keep businesses alive. We're doing this for us, but the stimulus debt will be saddled with the next generation to pay off. So we must make smart investments. We must ensure that we do not saddle the next generation with both a pandemic debt and a destroyed planet. That would be an inheritance too impossible to bear. So at this moment, stimulus funds must go towards zero carbon, nature positive and pollution-free societies and economies. Public and private finance must fuel that transition on energy, must fund a healthy planet, and must fund green jobs. This is a golden opportunity to change track, and that opportunity will in all likelihood not come back in generations. It is important to acknowledge that some finance and industry leaders have already woken up and are already shifting gear. They're realigning their capital with a future, a green future. Alliances are forming and money is shifting, while calls are growing stronger for action all across the industry. This was clear at the UNEP Finance Initiative Global Roundtable last month, where Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank, suggested that climate risk should be the criteria for selection in its bond purchase program. And Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, now advisor to the UN Secretary General, argued that the wages of bank executives should be tied to climate objectives. So we're moving in the right direction, but we need to move faster. You will hear that from Sir Partha Dasgupta. But let me just say now that the review that he has led on the economics of biodiversity calls for a global financial system that invests in natural assets. We need trillions of dollars in investments to retool and to green our global economy. Yet financial flows supporting natural assets range from only $78 billion to $143 billion per year, while governments are spending more than $500 billion on support that could harm biodiversity. We at UNEP see 4 essential actions needed to make sure that we accelerate our action on closing this gap to make every investment count. 1, we need to make sure that financial institutions need to start measuring and accounting for the impact of their financing. The finance sector needs to get better at measuring and communicating their impact, both in the positive outcomes of the financing like emissions reductions and the negatives like biodiversity loss or human rights violations. 2, financiers need to set real and comprehensive sustainability targets. Investors need to treat sustainability as a key indicator of portfolio performance, not as a corporate social responsibility effort. Bits of green investments on the fringes of otherwise dirty and toxic portfolios are not the way to go. Entire portfolios and entire organizations need to be consistent with the SDGs and with the Paris Agreement. 2 target frameworks that UNEP is pleased to be involved with are the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Principles for Responsible Banking. And 3, financial institutions need to follow the science. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, for example, relies heavily on science to set the timetable for net zero emissions in their portfolio. The Alliance has set clear intermediate targets to realign the portfolio on the way to 2050. Recently, Alliance members announced targeted greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the range of 16% to 29% by 2025. We must make more such science-led action, and we need to see that across the finance sector so that we can convert target into real, credible sectoral pathways for ensuring sustainability across the entire finance industry. And 4, transparency and accountability are essential. History has taught us that power often only serves the public good when held to account. We need financial powerhouses to open their books to scrutiny, to ensure that they make good on their commitments. The Principles for Responsible Banking, for example, requires third-party review on signatures' annual reporting. The signatures are establishing a civil society advisory body which allows important inputs from stakeholders that hold them to account. This is the kind of transparency that generates credibility and trust. Following these 4 tenets will go a long way to move the finance industry in the right direction. But we need every cent to be spent on shifting the needle on sustainability. This is not just because the Earth's beleaguered systems need the finance industry. It's because the finance industry and its future profitability need these natural systems much more. As the Green Horizon Summit makes clear, the green transition is a significant commercial opportunity that can drive job creation and deliver sustainable growth and profits. As we head into COP26, I urge all investors listening to this to think hard on how they can mobilize capital to close the financing gap between the net zero and sustainability ambitions and current reality. Doing so is in everybody's interest. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing about your deliberations and following your progress. Thank you.
A very warm welcome to our panel, Is Nature the Next Frontier? I'm Helen Avery with the Green Finance Institute, and I'm joined today by 4 panelists. We have Andrew Mitchell, Senior Advisor at Global Canopy. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. Margaret Kulau, Global Conservation Director at WWF International. Martin Berg, Partner at Pollination, and David Craig, CEO of Refinitiv. Thank you all so much for joining us for this panel. And we don't have long to convince everyone that nature is indeed the next frontier. So let's just dive in. We'll start with you, Andrew. So for the past, certainly 5 years since COP21, there's been such a huge global focus and coming together around climate risk. But the E in ESG, as I've heard you say before, has really been a C. It's been about carbon and climate. And it seems like the financial sector is getting its head around climate risk and investing for net zero. But this year, in particular, it feels like now that the financial value that nature has and the risk of biodiversity loss has been recognised. So you have spearheaded the launch of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the nature equivalent of the TCFD, the informal working group ahead of the task force launch this year. Many financial institutions within that group. Were you expecting the level of response you have had from the financial community? Can you tell us a bit more about the TNFD?
Actually, I wasn't expecting the response to be as big as it has been. I think there is a sort of penny drop moment that's occurred really in the last 18 months on the importance of nature. And this has been hugely accelerated, I believe, by the COVID pandemic. Because if you ever needed an exemplar of unrecognized nature-related risk, that is it. Because it's a tiny speck of nature, it's turned the world upside down. Our economies are all over the place and it's affected all our lives. And this has been caused by the degradation of nature, deforestation, the illegal trade in wildlife, and so on. And this is just demonstrating how nature-related risk can cut across a lot of sectors. It's big and it's fast. In fact, it's now delivering, governments are having to deliver around about 12.5 trillion in support finance to keep economies going. And no one expected this to happen. It came completely out of nowhere. We might have thought about plastics in the ocean, or climate change seems slow and lumbering, but this thing came like a rocket. So I think it's really woken up financial institutions to the impact of this, and interestingly, central banks as well. And so the other thing that's coming along, which is exciting, is the inflows into ESG funds. And the idea that you have to sacrifice profits for ESG funds is sort of gradually evaporating. Anybody who thinks that is probably about 10 years out of date now. And if you look at the inflows into new products like green bonds, green funds, and so on, they're really beginning to not only get big inflows, but they're getting performance as well. So all of these things combine so that when we put out the idea of having a task force on nature-related disclosure that was, in a sense, a twin of the TCFD, we got a lot of people knocking on our doors. So we have 63 financial institutions, governments, regulators, and others now who are working hard on this through an informal working group that started on the 25th of September. And what we're planning to do is to set up the scope and the plan and the resources to launch the task force next year. It'll have 4 phases of work, building the framework, the reporting and disclosure framework, testing it, consulting, and then launching it probably in early 2023. And I think this will fundamentally create a sort of systemic change in the way in which the financial sector is going to be initially voluntarily asked to think about its impacts and dependencies on nature and be able to report on it. Of course, this is not easy to do because data is a huge challenge in this sector. There's a lot of data around. It's not always held by companies. It's sometimes held by governments or academic institutions or NGOs. But one thing is certain, it's not in a form which is decision grade. So therefore, there's a huge opportunity for data providers, and we can see this happening because they're all buying up environmental related kind of service providers. They're all being bought up by S&P and Refinitiv, no doubt, and MSCI and others. You know, it's really interesting to see this change. So getting the data right is going to be very important. Getting the regulatory framework right is also beginning to happen because central banks are beginning to pick up on nature-related risk and asking, is this actually a systemic risk in our financial system or not? And the Dutch central bank produced a very interesting report this year called Indebted to Nature, using fundamentally a tool which Global Canopy had produced with UNEP-FI, the Encore tool. And they're finding $510 billion worth of risk there just in the Dutch portfolio that they looked at. So I think there's everything to go for. We're really looking forward to the Dasgupta review, which will be coming out very shortly, which will be looking at nature's stock and flows as assets that underpin our economy. That's going to be very interesting. So I think we're really seeing a change in perspective that's happening this year.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, and congratulations on the launching of the informal working group. Really looking forward to it. So nature's, not only recognised as a risk, as you've mentioned this year, but also there's been growing recognition of nature as an opportunity. So Martin, coming to you, it feels like a big year for this realisation that nature needs investment. And earlier this year, Pollination and HSBC came together to announce a natural capital fund aimed at raising £1 billion to invest in nature-based projects. Obviously felt like the right time. How investable is nature right now to an investor seeking risk-adjusted returns?
Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, let me slightly correct you. So what we announced is a joint venture between Pollination and HSBC Asset Management to form an asset management company focused on nature and on climate. And we do think that the time is absolutely right for this now. There is really a growing momentum on the investor side, not to only see nature as a risk in the way that Andrew just outlined, but also really as an opportunity. So I joined Pollination in June from the European Investment Bank, and they are the European Investment Bank. We've been investing in a lot of smaller scale natural capital investments, and I always got the same question from institutional investors, and they said, Martin, why can't you have an investment opportunity that is more sizable? Because then we could actually invest. And so what we've seen now since the launch is really that the timing has been quite good. There's growing interest in natural capital. I would argue that COVID to some extent has helped a little bit on this, because I think it really highlighted the interdependence of nature, of the economy, and on wealth. And there are also lots of companies out there that try now to really engage on this. So if you think about for Business for Nature, 560 companies that really call on governments to reserve nature laws, over 4 trillion revenues, or Finance for Nature, 26 financial institutions, and actually including HSBC, with a combined 3 trillion asset under management. All of those are looking now into nature and really want not only the risks we address, but also to see could this be an investment opportunity. The way we look at this in the joint venture, the HSBC Pollination joint venture, is really that we do think there's an investment strategy built around nature-related investments. On the core of that, we see sustainable agriculture and sustainable forestry, but also we see many what we call frontier opportunities, i.e. where, for example, forestry and agriculture could be combined. And I think the important part now is to really show that these type of investments are actually something that can be done from a commercial seeking institution and combine this with impact. And the impact part of this strategy that we are looking at is really the important part, because we want to show that it's not only possible to create return and impact, but in particular, it's actually possible to create return through impacts. And if you think about regenerative agriculture, for example, where there are many business models that allow to actually upgrade and increase yield and have a much more sustainable yield, and thereby also increase the financial return of a project, we think this is a significant opportunity.
Thanks, Martin. On this sort of point of making sure that, there's a positive impact, but there's also a return. Margaret, just wanted to come to you now. We're obviously recognizing the risks of nature's destruction, the opportunity for investment, the importance of impact. It feels like at this moment, as governments around the world are focusing on recovery, that this is a chance to build nature into those plans for recovery. Are you seeing this happen?
Thanks very much. Nice to see you all. I would say sort of. On the one hand, the stimulus packages that have come so far have not directed funds in a manner that recognizes the potential to build resilience through recovery. And much of the funding has been directed at economic activities that have the potential, in fact, to harm the environment. The latest Green Stimulus Index, for example, from Vivid Economics and Finance for Biodiversity, shows that there's been almost 13 trillion committed in stimulus funding so far, of which about 500 billion is green stimulus, so-called, and about 93 billion is targeted explicitly to biodiversity. In fact, that analysis found the announced stimulus packages will have a net negative environmental impact in 16 of the G20 economies. So it's concerning that the packages still don't reflect one of the key learnings, as was mentioned, of COVID, that our own health is intricately tied to our relationship with the natural world. And 3 to 4 new infectious diseases have emerged each year for the last 60 years or so, and the probability of spillover has gone up with deforestation and the expansion of agricultural land, intensification of livestock production, and increased harvesting of wildlife, in fact. So the World Economic Forum estimates about half of global GDP is either highly or moderately dependent on nature, and almost all aspects of human health and well-being depend on nature. We rely on it for food, for fiber, water, energy, medicines, and nature is key to everything from climate regulation and water quality to pollination services, flood control, and storm surge protection. I think it's also important to understand in the context of recovery that pandemic prevention is cost effective. So recent research published in Science magazine found that whereas the cost of actions to prevent the next pandemic may be on the order of about $22 to $31 billion a year, that would be less if you net out the climate benefits of some of those measures. Even the lowest cost estimate of the disease damage is more than $8 trillion. And the COVID-19 GDP losses so far are already over $5 trillion. So leaders are starting to pay attention. During the UN Summit on Biodiversity in September, political leaders from Albania to Uganda, over 77 countries from all regions of the world, signed something called the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. And the first commitment of that pledge, in fact, relates to recovery packages. They commit to put biodiversity, climate, and the environment as a whole at the heart of both the COVID-19 recovery strategies and investments in the pursuit of both national and international development and cooperation priorities. So the commitment's there. Now we need to see that commitment translate into a different approach to these recovery programs.
Is there anything to be said about sort of jobs as well, tying into sort of how the sort of nature creates jobs that maybe we're not thinking about enough or talking about enough?
Sure, we recently did some research with the ILO. There are about the International Labor Organization, there are about 1.2 billion jobs in sectors like farming, fisheries, forestry, and tourism. So clearly there is a strong opportunity to invest in nature as a way to bring back jobs as part of the recovery. So nature-based solutions, for example, can be very job intensive. Reforestation, watershed restoration, and as Martin just mentioned, some of these regenerative agricultural approaches are also very job intensive. So a way to bring back both jobs and the environment.
Right. So definitely something to that we need to embed, as you say, within a recovery, and hopefully that is starting to happen. Now, the elephant in the room, perhaps here, is the data, as Andrew alluded to. So, David, coming to you as our data expert, we obviously need to be able to measure the risk and measure the impact, positive or negative. So we need financial institutions and governments, regulators, so that they can sort of create the policies, internal or regulation and metrics that are, as Andrew mentioned, decision useful. In climate, we have the benefit of having this agreed global scenario of staying within a 1.5 to 2 degree increase, and we have emissions that are measurable. Biodiversity is entirely different. So can you fill us in? Where are we in having the data we need, and how do we get to where we need to be?
Well, I guess the good news is that certainly the appetite and investment in things related to climate and ESG is very, very high. And in fact, since the crisis, we saw a 4 to 5 times increase in the consumption of our ESG data, which we've been collecting for 20 years, and we've never seen the kind of demand that we're seeing now. But I think it was mentioned on the panel that it's not really E, it's C. It's very climate based. And in fact, if you look at our data sets, there's very little in there on nature and biodiversity. In fact, of the 10,000 companies we track, I think 24% declare that they even have a policy. So I think it's very, very early days. And as you say, the good news on climate is actually after a lot of work, years of work on standards and scope definitions and others, it's quite measurable now. And you can argue the accuracy, the measurability, but the financial market is getting quite used and mature at measuring climate impact and relating it to temperature increase. If you look at our infrastructure database, for example, we track 30,000 infrastructure projects. It's worth about $60 trillion. A third of them are in renewable projects, and there's increasing appetite in renewable energy projects. So a lot of interesting demand. The problem is that the financial institutions, and it's really encouraging to hear them signing up to the TNFD, it's very early days. There's not that much understanding of this topic. There's very little data that is usable, industrialized, repeatable. So whilst there is a lot of data swimming around, actually putting it to use is very hard, and putting it to use in a repeatable way is even harder. So I think this is a multi-year journey. Satellite data will play a role, other alternative data sets and monitoring will play a role, but there's a real need for standards, for policies, for frameworks in which this can be measured, so it can be put to use. The good news is that we've been through this with climate, and I think the financial markets have really grown up and matured. The question is, how long will it take on nature and biodiversity to go through the same journey?
Yeah. Thanks, David. So maybe we can sort of switch gears and talk about the pathway forward, certainly over the next 12 months, we lead up to COP and the decade ahead, and some of the actions we can take to get the capital moving. So I guess the first, coming back to you, Andrew, the first is, we need to sort of galvanise support and focus. And it sounds like you've done a lot of that already with the TNFD. But it can feel a little overwhelming when we start to approach nature. There's lots of strands to it. It's deforestation, it's plastics in oceans, it's agriculture, it's overfishing. Is there something we can collectively focus on in this decade ahead to reach our goal of reducing biodiversity loss in the same way that the transition to renewable energy has sort of captured our attention and focus in this goal of reducing carbon emissions? Can we find an equivalent of that story to sort of bring us all together?
Yeah, well, people sometimes ask me, what's the equivalent of renewable energy in the nature sector? And I think it's probably renewable food. We need renewable food. We're going to see a big shift, I think, of emphasis from fossil fuels to our food system. And the reason is that the food system is the biggest destroyer of nature on the planet, caused by supply chains, which we all need and use in order to provide commodities that we all use to make the food we eat. But it's become heavily industrialized. It's not looking after the soil very well. And food that we think is cheap actually isn't very cheap, because a lot of the costs and externalities that are not included in the price of the products that we all use. So I think the food industry is going to come under a lot of scrutiny, and things like vertical farming are going to create great opportunities, new things like Beyond Meats and so on, and Impossible Meats, all these sort of disruptive factors are going to come into that, plus changing diet as well, with people not wanting to eat in the same way they've ate in the past. So I think the food is going to be ripe for opportunity and excitement. And but of course, we've got to look at infrastructure, extractive sectors, and so on. There are about 22 sectors that are the most acutely affected by dependency on nature and impact. So they're going to come into the frame here. The problem we have, there's two things that we've got big problems to solve. First of all, nature has no number. What do I mean by that? Well, it doesn't have a metric like a ton of CO2 where you can measure progress one way or the other. It doesn't have a target like a 1.5 degree target either. And we hope that the CBD will come up with some targets. So one of the targets is let's protect 30% of the Earth by 2030 and 50% by 2050 and things like this. So we need some targets to come out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the other thing that we really do need to get to grips with is the impact of subsidies. I mean, all the money that governments are putting in to protect nature are 5 times less than the harmful subsidies that are being put out to support the agriculture and fossil fuel industry. So, you really can't win. There's no point in even doubling the money that governments are putting in to protect nature in that situation. So these things really are going to have to be tackled as part of this whole transformation of our economic system.
Well, so not too much we have to do, but at least we can sort of start, as you say, sort of focusing down into transition of food, 30 by 30. There are some sort of big themes that we can sort of bring everyone collectively together around. Margaret, so this mention of governments, from the work you've been doing, is there anything specific that you've seen that governments could do to help mobilise capital into nature-based solutions, or or reducing money flowing into the destruction of nature?
Well, I think to use some of those examples that Andrew just went through, if you look at the evolution of renewable energy, first there was public investment in R&D for new technology. There were public investment incentives and blended finance instruments. We're going to need both of those for biodiversity. In fact, I think for biodiversity, we'll especially need public finance and insurance risk tools in the places where it's really hard to get private finance to flow and public funds are especially tight. And those also tend to be the places where biodiversity may be richest and most at risk. And we'll also need financial tools to scale. When we talked about green bonds, that was really the way to get renewable energy investment to scale a number of years ago. And the green bond market was really started by the public sector, public financial institutions. So I think all of those are good examples for how we might think about the same sort of transition for biodiversity finance. And as Andrew mentioned, we need governments to stop incentivizing damage in the first place. So just in the agriculture, forestry, and fisheries sector, subsidies that are harmful to nature total more than $500 billion a year. And to get to the food sector, there are also significant hidden costs. So the current market value of the global food system is about $10 trillion. At the same time, the hidden costs of the global food system, from things like GHG emissions, food waste, cost of obesity, is about $12 trillion. So that means we have a food system right now that's a net value destroyer. So rather than fund environmental degradation, public funds need to be put into work instead to promote a job-intensive recovery that rebuilds for climate, for economic, for social resilience. And investment in natural infrastructure like reefs, like forests, like wetlands, they bring climate resilience as well as health benefits. And in some cases, we're talking to the infrastructure sector. Natural infrastructure like a mangrove, for example, may be a more cost-effective way than gray infrastructure for storm surge management. So in short, we need governments to provide incentives for private investment in nature. They need to stop funding and subsidizing harmful activities, and they need to invest in nature for a job-rich recovery that builds both economic, environmental, as well as social resilience.
Thank you. Martin, maybe then coming to you, given that you worked previously with the EIB's Natural Capital Finance Facility, so you've seen the use of public sector financial support to pump prime investments. You and I have talked at length before about the challenges of building a pipeline so we end up getting sizable, scalable, replicable, nature-based projects that investors can get behind. Do we need more blended finance facilities? To Margaret's point, how do we start mobilising the capital?
Yeah, no, thank you. Perhaps I wouldn't call it pump the prime, but demonstrating business models that that are feasible, and I think there blended finance can play a huge role. And as you said, that's in my prior job at the EIB, that's exactly what we've been working on, trying to demonstrate business models, helping the private sector to invest in investment opportunities that they perhaps perceived as too risky, but overall were actually viable. I think to be honest, as usual with all of those things, the proof is in the pudding. In the end, a lot of those blended finance vehicles are very long-term vehicles, and we will see where they lead. I think the one thing, though, I'd like to mention is one issue I see with many of the blended finance vehicles is really the scale and the scalability. And I think this is really what we ought to now, if we want to bring nature to the next level, we have to really think about that. There are quite a few really good examples where blended finance has helped institutional investors or other private investors to invest into nature-related investors. But we also see quite a few examples where they get stuck there, i.e. that you always need this public finance in order to get the private sector investors in there. And I think in order to reach really scale, what we need to demonstrate is that natural capital, nature-related investments are actually good investment opportunities. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do now at Pollination, to see whether in the fund that we're proposing to really go on and saying we have to actually start with the economic return, and we have to really combine this with impact, and in our view it's actually really possible to create financial return through impact. So that's a really important point of it. Having said that, in particular, we all know that nature is undervalued. So there are situations where it's extremely difficult to even demonstrate those projects. So on individual project level, I think there is still a lot of scope for blended finance to demonstrate new forms of, for example, payment for ecosystem services, or actually they help to create the data requirements that larger investors actually have so that they can invest in the longer term.
Thank you. And David, you're going to round us up here, I think, in this discussion, and perhaps coming back full circle to disclosures and reporting. What can we do to ensure that financial institutions and private sector are equipped, well, the financial institutions really, equipped to reorient their loan and investment portfolios to sort of become nature positive, if you will, whether that's, assessing risk and not investing in certain things, or putting their money to other things?
Well, I think to your phrase, nature positive, I mean, helping the financial institutions understand what that means is probably the first step, because if we heard from this discussion, it's not black and white. There's very many different techniques, technologies, scientific developments. It's different by use of land or geography or area. I do worry a little bit that the financial institutions might be expected to be the policeman of nature and biodiversity, but it's very hard to be the policeman if the laws, the rules are very unclear. And so we've got to help them on that journey. And as I said earlier, it's very, very early days. There's a lot of expertise around, but for the financial institutions, this is early days. I think disclosures play a role, but they're not a silver bullet. I think helping the financial institutions understand through disclosures, particularly at an asset level, what's happening in terms of biodiversity and nature focus is really important. Disclosures tend to focus on large public companies, though. A lot of the disclosures that are required tend to be the smaller private companies, particularly in emerging markets. So we've got to focus differently, I think, from climate. Decision grade data, access to data sources such as usability, relevance, land use is really important. I think governments do have a lot of this data. There's a lot of data trapped in satellite information, be it on land or in oceans. We shouldn't pretend there's suddenly a magic alternative data source that addresses this, but there is data available that could be made more widely available and also industrialized and scaled to help it. And materiality, we need to consider what the priorities are and which sectors, geographies or contexts have the greatest materiality of the risks or the opportunity that's there. And I think that can be extremely helpful. It's been a strong debate in climate around materiality. I think some great breakthroughs were made. I think we need that materiality debate in nature as well. And then policies, if you can push for biodiversity and forestation policies and banks, again, it's helpful, but it's not sufficient, but it's a start. But I think we need to help the financial institutions develop those through either government initiatives or third-party sectors, because it's a specialist topic at the moment. They need a lot of learning and understanding and skills to help to create those kind of policies before they can really become effective. So a few things there. It's early days. The data is not yet widely available. It needs to be industrialized, but it needs to map the materiality. It needs to map the policies and the rules that are set out, and it needs to map the priorities of what really matters.
So a lot to do, but too much to lose to not just get along and doing it. So I really appreciate all of your insights and your dedication to nature, and hopefully together you've set this trajectory for the next 12 months and certainly the decade ahead. So thank you so much again for sharing your time with us today. I look forward to continuing to hear your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Achieving a transition to a net zero economy will require a whole economy transition. That means every bank, every insurer, every investor, every company will need to adapt their business model. And that's why the focus for COP26 is to create a framework for the private financial sector in which every financial decision takes climate change into account. Now, that's a simple objective, but it has a number of components covered in other sessions of this meeting on risk, on return, and on reporting. And the focus now is on creating the right markets, mobilization. And there's no more important market than a new market, professional market for carbon offsets. Because after all, as companies move to have net zero transition plans, it's exceptionally important that the net in the net zero, the offset, is credible, verifiable, transparent, and is truly preserving that precious and very limited carbon budget. It also, creating this market will also create an enormous green investment opportunity, much of which, if not most of which, will flow to emerging and developing economies, bringing vital capital flows and investment at a time when the transition is imperative. But in order for any of that to happen, we need a functioning and professional market. The current market, or markets, for carbon offsets are fragmented. The verification standards are limited. The data availability is sparse. There's confusion between buyers and sellers, unstable demand, low prices, in fact, very wide range of prices for very similar objectives. And so as a consequence, these current voluntary markets struggle with low liquidity and scarce financing. In fact, I think the case for professionalizing this market is made by the size of the market last year, just a little over $300 million of transactions, when these projects should be measured in the tens of billions of dollars per year. So in order to get there, we need to address barriers across the value chain. And that's why the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets was set up under the sponsorship of the Institute for International Finance and Tim Adams' leadership, chaired by Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, and the operating lead, Annette Nazareth of Davis Polk, formerly of the SEC. This is an incredibly powerful and informed and insightful group. There's over 50 firms from 20 different sectors of the financial sector, including some of the buyers of these offsets, so companies in the real economy, and they're spread across 6 continents. They've been working hard since September, discussing concrete barriers and proposing solutions to scale up these markets and their potential to drive up this critical area of finance. Now, today they've published a report. It's a draft for consultation. It's the result of those months of intensive discussion and generation of potential solutions. I want to thank all the members of the task force and the more than 80 members of the accompanying consultation group for providing their time, their expertise, their energy, and their ideas in developing this valuable report. Now, this is a report with a purpose. It is not an academic exercise. It is not going to sit on a shelf. It is going to be translated in the coming weeks into a blueprint for that market, and our intention is to have a pilot market up and running in 12 months' time by Glasgow in November 2021. So the report feeds into action. I encourage all of you watching to get engaged, to help translate these ideas into reality, create this critical market to help conserve our precious carbon budget, to drive investment around the world to move towards a net zero future. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the panel to discuss in more detail. Thank you very much.
Mark, thanks very much for that very, very warm and robust introduction. I think you covered a lot of the ground that we will need to. But before we dive into the panel that Sir Ronald Cohen will be moderating for me and Tim Adams and Annette and with us, I thought I'd make just a few comments to try to expand on some of the things that you said. As you pointed out, this is a private sector initiative. We know that there are multiple government efforts, both individual and coordinated, to address the climate problem. We also know that the level of commitments that are being made by many, if not eventually all of us in the private sector, be those corporations, individuals, or everything in between, these commitments are both robust, they're increasing in size, and in order for us to hit those commitments, and as you said, to make the net in net zero effective, we're going to have a very large, robust, transparent, verifiable carbon market. And we've, under at your initiative, we have set up this task force of private sector entities. You mentioned the composition, over 50 global corporations representing all elements of the carbon supply and value chain, as well as NGOs, intermediaries, infrastructure providers, etc. But maybe we just take a step back and talk about why we need to do this. I mean, surely the primary focus is much of the rest of what we've been talking about at this Green Horizon Summit, which is ways that each of us, whether we're corporations or individuals, can reduce our carbon footprint, reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. And we know, just looking at the math, how this works out, that if we all do everything that we think we can do today, it's not enough. it's not enough to contain the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need a significant amount of incremental money that will go into outright reductions, further reductions in our carbon footprint and sequestration. That money needs to come from someplace. And we know that there have been many investors and other savers who have said, we want to put our money into this high impact requirement. But the facility to get the money from the people that want to invest into the hands of the people that can make a difference through these, in many cases, cutting edge and expensive projects, that mechanism isn't very clear right now. And as Mark pointed out, the market is not transparent. It's not large. It's not consistently credible. And we think that it's just absolutely essential that the voluntary carbon market fill that gap to make sure that that increment of financing that's required to get us from what we can all do in the ordinary course of our improvements through to the amount of capital and change that's required to keep within this 1.5 degree target, to make sure that that happens. So how have we gone about this? Well, we've got a set of recommendations that we've released today. Strongly encourage all of you to read through those and engage in this process. 52 members from around the world and across the carbon value chain, over 85 institutions that have provided expert advice and are really pressure testing the recommendations that we're making. We've had some good, healthy discussions about this. There's not consensus on everything, which is why when you read the report, you'll see that there are plenty of questions that are asked about things that are still open, or things where we would benefit from the views of incremental thoughtfulness from the much broader community. What do we hope that this achieves? Well, we hope that we can achieve a consensus on a way to get to the core foundations of a voluntary carbon market that hits all the attributes that Mark set out in terms of transparency, verifiability, credibility, and the like. Of course, there will always be a call it an over-the-counter market or a by-appointment market that can operate alongside the core markets that we would like to help develop. But the key for the overall market to grow and achieve this required level of robustness is to have a core market that is understandable, verifiable, and gives a very clear pricing signal. So we talked a little bit about the interplay between public and private sector. The bulk of what you see, virtually all of what you'll see in the report, is the role that the private sector can play. We've all made commitments. My bank has committed to be net zero by 2030 for our own operations. We know that a lot of our carbon footprint relates to the activity of our clients who are producing power or shipping or transporting or manufacturing. We want to play our role in helping those companies to migrate from higher carbon intensity to lower carbon intensity. Like us, it's unlikely that they can reduce their net emissions to zero. They will need to go into the market to buy offsets in order to hit their net zero targets, much as we can. For this to be effective, we will need to have clear standards. We've got some very crisp thoughts in the report on how we might achieve that. Transparent data, a robust market infrastructure, an agreed set of financial instruments that can trade on that infrastructure. These are the necessary ingredients for a successful carbon market. And as you'll see in the task force blueprint that we set out, we've got 6 specific areas for action. First is to identify those core carbon principles and the taxonomy of attributes. So what are the characteristics of the core contract that we want to identify and would hope would get the market attention to establish a liquid, robust, and transparent market? What are the taxonomy of attributes? By definition, what are the attributes that aren't included in the core carbon contract? Those may be the bases either for future contracts or for over-the-counter or by appointment transactions that are done separately, but ideally referencing that core carbon contract, contributing to the underlying liquidity of this market. Second is that these core contracts should be traded on a recognized exchange. They should be supported, number 3, by an infrastructure for trade, post-trade financing, and data. Critical to the success of the establishment of this market is an understandable and transparent meta registry of the things that are supporting these core contracts. Number 4 is a consensus on the legitimacy of the offset market. At times, we've heard people say, please don't focus on offsets, just focus on reduction. The offsets are a way to cheat, to get around the carbon commitments that we're making. That's not the way we see it. Rather, we think we can create a carbon contract and an offset contract that is recognized as legitimate in terms of achieving the purpose for which it was created. That it's key through governance structures and through understanding that we develop that consistency and that consensus on the legitimacy of carbon offsets. Fifth is the integrity of the market. So we know that all markets are subject to abuse or subject to the shortcomings of a lack of transparency. We also know that markets can be used by bad actors for illicit purposes. So we've got to make sure that as we build this market, that we've got a clear eye on integrity and the assurance of integrity. And finally, is demand. While we've all been encouraged by the number of companies that have stepped forward to say that they're going to reduce their carbon footprint dramatically in many cases, we know that the demand for carbon offsets is still actually lower than the supply today. Hence, the price that I think we would all recognize is quite low to the extent that you can observe that at all. So getting that demand drive up and running is absolutely critical. Now, where are we here? We'll take the thoughts coming back from this consultation paper, and we'll now shift our focus to implementation. So from now until January, we'll focus on taking the feedback that we can get through the consultation, developing an implementation roadmap. We want to ensure that this is more than just a report. Right? This is going to do no good if it's just a doorstop. Rather, we want to catalyze future market actors to pursue tangible actions. That means that if you're bothering to listen to this conversation at all, you're intending to make a difference in this fight. To the extent that we can coalesce around the actions the concrete actions that we can all be taking now to scale up this voluntary carbon market, will be contributing to our end goal. And we want to set up a committed coalition to collaborate. Right? So this is not a one firm or one person effort. This will require the market to come together into a common and collective area of focus instead of areas of focus. So like the Task Force for Climate Financing Disclosures, which was an earlier effort led by Mark Carney, that had a substantially catalyzing effect on the disclosure of climate-related risks and exposures, we would like the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets to also have a catalytic effect, so that we can have a much greater impact than the sum of our individual contributions to this effort. So the wheels are in motion. Things are happening. We want this to turn from a set of ideas to a set of commitments. We're all very keen to get going and actually watch this market grow from the paltry size that Mark mentioned to something in the billions of dollars that will get the money into the hands of the people that can really make a difference in reducing our carbon footprint. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Sir Ronald Cohen to lead the rest of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you at the summit organized by the City of London, and I'm delighted that the City of London is planting its flag firmly in the space, because I do think it's the space of the future. I'm delighted to welcome Annette Nazareth, a former commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission and partner at Davis Polk Wardwell, and Tim Adams, the CEO of the Institute of International Finance, who speaks to us from Washington. And I'd like to just set the scene as I see it. I read your report with great interest, and with my perspective as chair of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, but also as chair of the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative at Harvard Business School. I have been following your efforts with great interest. The reason, as the previous session before ours was saying, the reason is that we are moving towards greater transparency on the environmental damage and indeed the social damage that companies are creating. The effort I lead, or I chair at the Harvard Business School, it's led by George Terafim, a professor of accounting, has already published a data set of 1,800 companies. And if I just illustrate a couple of the conclusions, it sets the scene for the practical discussion we're about to engage in. You can see in dollar terms that these 1,800 companies deliver $3 trillion of environmental damage a year. $3 trillion, just 1,800 companies. You can see that 250 of these companies deliver more environmental damage in a year than they do in profit, and that a third deliver 25% or more of their profit in environmental damage. So this suggests that as we begin to realize that this impact information is price sensitive, which shows up in the Harvard data, you can see a correlation between greater environmental damage and lower stock market ratings relative to competitors. Regulators are going to have to step in and to mandate the publication by companies of impact-weighted accounts that reflect not just their profit, but also their operational impact, their employment impact, and their product impact on people and planet. So we have $3 trillion worth of potential demand for offsets during a transition period, which companies are going to have to go through before they become net impact positive. And so, Tim, if I may ask this question. Your organization has sponsored the work of the task force. Following this work, do you emerge more comfortable that the carbon market can actually play a major role in getting us to bring companies to become impact positive?
Sure. A great question, Sir Ronald. Thank you. And it's such an honor to be here with Bill and Annette, good friends, and really leading this effort. And I don't know where we'd be without them in the positions they're in. Yes, I think this initiative and others like it can be an incredibly important catalyst for intermediating the trillions of dollars of demand that I think is out there that will develop and become visible over the coming years. And it's not only the right thing to do, it's also good business for us. You know, our industry, and we represent the full spectrum of financial intermediation, every node across the spectrum is interested in this topic. They see it as they're listening to their clients, they're listening to their investors, they're listening to their employees. They see where trends are going. They want to be a part of it. And we see trillions that we want to put to work for a noble and important cause, maybe the most important, if not the most important, most consequential issue we will work on in our professional careers.
Thank you. And Annette, if I may ask you a question. You've been a regulator and you're very conscious of the inadequacies today of regulation of this carbon offset market. Do you feel that there really is scope to create a transparent and liquid market of real scale here that will be in the billions and even trillions?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think I'm very optimistic about that. I think that we have all of the building blocks for a liquid and transparent market. I mean, the wonderful thing about this group that we brought together was we brought together participants from all over the market ecosystem. And as a result, I think we have a really wonderful opportunity to build a market that, excuse me, I'm having a little connectivity trouble here, so let me just get off that. We have an opportunity to take all, as I said, all the building blocks. So for instance, we have participants from existing exchanges. These people obviously know what it takes to have a regulated market that functions well. We had market infrastructure providers, those who would provide pricing data. We had representatives of buyers and sellers, and we had participants who would be involved in ratings or that kind of thing. So when you bring together all of these pieces and you sort of build a model based on existing vibrant markets, it makes me very optimistic that this will work.
And who do you think is going to be the regulator of this market?
Well, I don't know if we know that just yet. I think, part of the consultation that we're going through, we'll have people sort of recommend who they think could do it. Certainly, I think to the extent that we have not only a cash market, but a futures market, it would probably be likely that an organization or a regulator such as the Commodity Futures Trading Commission would be involved. But for the cash market, we'll see. We'll see, what existing organizations may be involved and could really help oversee this activity, because obviously market integrity is going to be very important. And I know, Bill talked about sort of all the building blocks of and the general principles of our report, but certainly having a market that is not just robust, but free of fraud, has integrity, that's going to be certainly focused on sort of the traditional issues such as AML, know your customer type, principles as well. All of those things will be built in.
Thank you. And so, Bill, you've been a great proponent of business, and that includes banking and investment, helping government to overcome these huge climate challenges that we face. But as you hinted in your comments, the way to reduce these carbon emissions is to change the behavior of companies. Governments talking together can't do it on their own. How do you see the carbon market interacting with companies and banks and investors over the next 4 or 5 years to achieve real scale? Today, there are issues both of supply, of opportunities, of offset opportunities, and demand for carbon offsets. So if you look ahead to 4 or 5 years, how do you see us actually making progress in scaling up this market?
I think that the objective has to be, and I think we can achieve this objective, to create a virtuous circle. So we've started with the first item in the virtuous circle is a recognition that we have a problem. And I think that's pretty universally accepted right now. Number two is to have companies, or let's just say broadly emitters, because of course some of the emitters are us as individuals as well, but to have us accept that there's a problem and also feel pressure for one reason or other to do our part to address that problem. I think many of us will act out of a sense of civic duty. Others will act because their stakeholders have told them that they really want them to act. So we've seen that the owners of companies, the owners of emitters, have been putting increasing pressure on the companies in their portfolio to take action to address a problem that we all see. And that's a good thing. I think the corporate world has responded to stakeholders saying, we want you to take action. In exchange for that, we see that there's money flowing into the hands of the people who can actually create the reduction technology, or that can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere through one mean or other. There's endless good ideas and people that would like to do good things that simply don't have the financing. Or even if they could get the financing, it's just a little bit too hard and a little bit too slow. So part of the virtuous circle is to congeal the community of offset creators, so that the people can get the carbon out of our environment, to get them out asking for their share of the money that's coming out of the hands of the people that are being pressured through themselves or others to reduce their own emissions or purchase offsets. So as we get this virtuous circle going, so far you notice I've not mentioned government, right? But as we get this virtuous circle going, we'll have increasing pressure on all of us to reduce our emissions. We'll have an increasing moral imperative. We'll have improving technology that will consistently drive down the cost of offsetting carbon. That should lead to a dramatic expansion of the size of the market. Now, along the way, governments will take action. We've seen very discrete actions from a number of governments, typically on a relatively local basis. And I think like any other market, when you have a state actor that comes in and intervenes in the market, it can have a big effect. We need look no further than the market for interest rates, where governments and central banks regularly intervene. It doesn't mean the market doesn't function. It means that the market adapts very, very quickly. And I think governments can play an enormously catalyzing role or accelerating role through their actions. But we shouldn't wait for that. The private sector should get its act together and go out there and do the things that we can do today. And then if the government comes in and makes it all a little bit easier or a little bit faster, so much the better.
So as we look at what is driving today the effort to tackle climate change, we see that it started off with consumers and employees of companies refusing to purchase the products or work for companies that were polluting heavily or using child labor. And then that investors became aware of it. And today we see more than $30 trillion of ESG funding flowing to achieve impact as well as profit. We see $1 trillion this year of impact investment, where you don't just have, as you do in ESG, the intention to create a positive impact on the environment or on society, but you also measure the impact that has been created. So we have more than 30% of professionally managed assets going now to achieve impact as well as profit. And we see at the shareholder meeting a couple of weeks ago of Procter & Gamble, a rebellion by shareholders where 2/3 of shareholders vote against management and require information on the deforestation which P&G's use of palm oil is causing. I think we're going to see these rebellions multiply, both in the environmental but also in the social area around diversity and economic inequality and so on and so forth. So how, if I'm right, and if this transparency will be with us within the next 3 to 5 years in the form of mandated publication of impact-weighted accounts. And for those who may not have followed it, just this year alone, we have had IFRS, which is in charge of international accounting outside of the US. We've had the International Federation of Accountants. We have had the World Economic Forum. And we have IOSCO, the organization that brings regulators together, talking about sustainability accounting. So this is on the way. The reason I take time to just develop this point, and I open the question to the three of you, is we're going to need a massive increase in the offset opportunities that exist. I tried to buy an offset just a few weeks ago. The types of opportunities that are around don't really deliver significant environmental impact, many of them. So how are we going to, I know that the supply of money creates its own demand, and that over a long period of time we will see new offset opportunities. But in your work, have you found a way to boost now the supply of decent offset opportunities that really have impact on the environment?
Ronnie, the issue isn't supply. There are plenty of projects that have been tabled that can get us on the path to 1.5 degrees and net zero by 2050. The problem is financing of those supplies. Those projects require money. We put out a report just yesterday. It said and we surveyed the international investors, $50 trillion question around the amount of financing that's required in order for us to hit these targets. The amount of funding against that $50 trillion of required financing is less than 60%. And if you get into critical regions like the continent of Africa, the available funding is less than 10%. of the amount that's required. So what's preventing the capital from getting from the hands of all those investors that you mentioned, all the investors that are in our $50 trillion question survey? What's keeping that money from getting into the hands of the African project managers that can actually affect the climate output that we're all looking for? Well, there's a long list, but one of them is having exactly the clarity that you talked about when you went out to buy your carbon offsets personally, that you weren't sure that the offset that you were buying was going to have the desired or intended impact or the advertised impact. So that's why standards are so important. That's why transparency is so important. That's why having a centralized meta registry is so important. Perhaps using blockchain technology or something like that can add to a sense of assurance. That's why it's not just about the time that you purchase the carbon offset, but the way that those projects are monitored over their life to make sure that the impact that was intended at the outset carries on. That's why we're having discussions about whether we should be attaching a lower carbon offset weighting to older offsets. Do these things expire? Do they have a sell-by date? I mean, these are some of the questions that we've raised. But in answering those questions, we will be making it much more likely that the $50 trillion that eventually is needed makes its way from the hands of the people who are prepared to invest into the hands of the people who are willing and able to invest that capital for the climate purposes that we've committed to. But there's a real break in the transmission mechanism between the two. And one critical part of achieving that transmission mechanism effectively is a large, robust, verifiable, scalable carbon market.
And when you all think in terms of investors participating in this market, is the bulk of the market going to be companies trying to offset the environmental damage you describe and that I've described based on the Harvard data? Do you see a role for financial investors to get involved in this market?
Be precluded from doing so, but don't you think, Tim? I mean, I should let you speak as well, but I think certainly I would expect there to be a large institutional component. And as you said, it's certainly going to be a number of large corporations that are not able to get their carbon footprint down fast enough to meet the goals, and therefore, will be, purchasing the offsets to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement as quickly as possible. But I don't think that the participation in this market will be limited to that. And as you say, even as an individual yourself, you've looked for opportunities to invest in offsets. I'm sorry, Tim, did you have something as well?
The demand is there, not only from the corporate sector, and will more so over time, not only corporate, but small, medium-sized businesses, but at the retail level. You have a whole generation that is coming into the workforce and financial capacity, and they're demanding change. And I was at my favorite coffee shop this morning getting coffee. I thought, what if I, at the point of sale, I could spend an extra quarter or dime that went to the carbon offset for that coffee getting here? It doesn't exist. But we know that the technology companies, the Silicon Valleys of the world, will certainly, once inspired and once incentivized, will come up with solutions. And we know the demand over time will scale as well. And with that, as long as we have the market mechanisms in place, price discovery and integrity and consistency and good quality data, that the demand will come. Ultimately, and my staff hear me say this all the time, I'd love to see a day when the retail sector, when it's like food labeling for financial products, that when you go buy a box of cereal, you know how much there's sugar and trans fats, and it's easy to compare. We need the same kind of transparency, simplicity for retail products so that we know what products that we're buying, what is their carbon content. And so that's ultimately my dream. How do we get there? But you got to have good data, and you got to have the markets that we're trying to build.
So I think the good news, Tim, is the data exists now. And I encourage you all to go to the impact-weighted account site at Harvard Business School, where you can see the different environmental impacts monetized of these 1,800 companies. And I agree with you, we are not far. We're not far from the day when you will have an app on your phone and you will point it at the barcode of a product, and you will find out how much, if you want to buy a box of Twinings tea in the UK, and you point your phone at the barcode on it, you'll discover that Associated British Foods creates $1.8 billion of environmental damage a year against $1.6 billion of profit. And you will find out also the environmental and the health impact, as you were saying, saturated fats and sugar content and so on, monetized. I think we are really getting close to that. Technology will enable us to do it. I suppose the question in all our minds must be, if we want to have a huge increase in the size of this market, what is going to drive it? And you're all saying we need to create a market that is capable of being a proper market. The supply and the demand exists for that market to take off. So all we need to do is to perfect that market. I personally agree with you. But is that the general view as you've worked on your consultation, or do you have skeptics who think otherwise?
I don't think we've had skeptics. I think we've had, we've been very heartened by the enthusiasm for this. I mean, hearkening back to something that Bill said, he said that there's no shortage of supply. I think that's right. I think the problem we've had is the demand signals. There's not been the demand for the offsets has not been as clear. And I think once we get the transparency around the types of things that you're talking about, I mean, we are seeing a groundswell of interest in climate change, in our carbon footprint. And if and you've talked about what's happening in corporations all over the world, where shareholders are speaking up and saying that they want this to be something that the companies that they're investing in are working towards. And I think that once we bring together that information and bring together the demand side and the supply side, I think if we build it, as they like to say, they will come. And I think that the timing couldn't be better for this, because I think we're going to see a very big pop, as I think you're seeing, in the interest of investing in these types of things.
Well, I think the demand will be driven by the increasing transparency, and
Right.
that Procter and Gamble being exposed now on the extent of diversification and having to publish numbers about the extent of it. We're going to find this pressure coming from all different directions, and we have to achieve this transparency sooner rather than later if we want to have real impact on climate, it seems to me, because we've taken 3 or 4 decades for governments to talk to each other to try to find a solution. But the solution lies in changing the behavior of companies. In Bill, when Standard & Chartered is making a loan, having the information to be able to understand whether the company involved is net impact positive or net impact negative, and if it is negative, then whether it's negative in areas that are going to be risky for its future. So it seems to me that your task force has come at a crucial time when this market really is poised for growth. What do you hope to achieve now in the implementation phase that is coming up? We just have a minute left, so perhaps each of you, we'll start with you, Annette.
Well, we're not finished. As you know, we worked very hard, and we're very grateful to Green Horizon Summit for giving us this hard date where we were issuing our blueprint. But there's more work to be done. I mean, we're in a consultation phase now, and we're very much encouraging of all participants around the globe to engage in our survey and give us their comments. And that survey is available on the IIF website. And we were going to take those findings and those of our task force and our consultation group and issue, the final blueprint in January. But in addition, we're working on a roadmap now, which is the next steps. And so it's as both Bill and Tim like to say, we're not doing this report just to sit on a shelf or serve as a doorstop. We're continuing our work now, towards the roadmap and what are the concrete things that we need to do to actually get a market up and running.
Well, Annette, I think you've answered for all the panelists. We're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Bill. A great panel. We will leave the last word to Dr. Sanjayan, CEO of Conservation International, who's a member of the Task Force Consultative Group.
Hello, my name is Sanjan. I'm the CEO of Conservation International, and thank you for giving me a couple of minutes to speak to you. First and foremost, really thankful and appreciative of the work that the task force is doing and very encouraged by recent progress. Look, conservation financing, carbon financing, even though this is a voluntary market, carbon financing is absolutely crucial to scale. There's no way we are going to even approach some of the targets that have been set by the Paris Climate Agreement if we don't have that scale behind us. And the financing, carbon financing, even though we're operating in this voluntary market, is going to be crucial to it. Now, what's encouraging to me is that there is a hunger, there's a demand by customers, by companies, by private citizens, by consumers, if you will, for carbon projects. We're in some sense constrained really by supply, by high quality supply. And that is the thing that I really want to focus on right now, because yes, the infrastructure, the plumbing, if you will, is crucially important. But what really drives markets, what markets depend on, is confidence. And for us to be able to give that confidence to the market, we have to have high quality projects. We cannot let our guard down. We have to maintain a high bar. We cannot just scale and go for size. We have to go for also quality with size, right? So quality becomes really important as well. And what I mean by quality, it means not only being able to derive a return, this we all understand, but it also means having an impact, a positive impact, obviously, on climate, but also on the communities, on people, on jobs, and on nature and biodiversity. Especially in these early days, there's no doubt going to be some bobbles. We will get some things wrong. That's the nature of new markets. However, it's important that transparency, good monitoring and transparency is built into our projects so that when we do stumble, we can learn from it and we are not afraid of owning up to it as a way of continually raising the bar. If we can do that, if we can use the task force, we can use this to really push for impact and build that confidence in the markets, I think this is probably the most exciting thing I certainly, as a conservationist, have ever seen in my life, and maybe forever. This amount of potential support and funding for conservation is extraordinary. But in order to tap that and tap that effectively, we have to get it right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Look forward to engaging further.
Partha, hello. We've just heard about the nature crisis being a global challenge, and that tackling the twin threats of biodiversity loss and climate change require us to invest more in nature. Partha, you were commissioned by the UK's Treasury to review the economics of biodiversity loss, a huge subject. And may I say, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to be working on that review with you. It really has.
Thank you.
But as your review's interim report made clear back in April, you frame the current nature crisis as an asset management problem. Could you unpack that for us a bit and explain how the concept of nature as a financial asset fits into traditional economic thinking?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's. I think the best thing to do is to start by asking what we might mean by asset management. And one usually thinks of it as a financier moving vast sums of money around. But I'm thinking of assets here, the review thinks of assets here as, and its correct way to do it, it is real goods and services, goods in particular. An asset is a durable good, okay, in contrast to a service. And of course, the asset offers services. And for that point of view, we are all asset managers, every one of us, whether you're a farmer, fisherman, whether you're in Niger or whether you're in China, whether you're in India, or United States, UK, it doesn't matter. Every householder is an asset manager. And we might think of classifying assets, and that's a correct way to do things, thinking of produced capital assets, roads, buildings, human capital, education, health. These are conventional terms now. Even human capital is conventional. But then there is nature, and we now call it natural capital to bring it in proximity to the others. I mean ecosystems, generally speaking, could be mangroves, could be wetlands. These are real goods, durable goods, which can be tarnished. And we aspire to manage these portfolios of assets, whether it's the farmer or the fisherman, as best as they can under the circumstances, given the constraints they face, the scarcity values they observe for them. Now, humanity globally is failing to manage its global portfolio of assets efficiently. We are continually depleting our natural capital, ecosystems like estuaries, forests, and mangroves, in some cases to the point of collapse. And it is important to recognize that it's not about the future only. Poor people in the poorest of countries have observed their own local assets collapse. So we're not talking about unexplained phenomena or anticipated phenomena only. And biodiversity, the subject of my review, is a characteristic of portfolios, of ecosystems. They make ecosystems productive and resilient. Estimates show that between 1994 and 2014, to give you just an example of how we have tarnished nature, produced capital per head globally doubled, and human capital per head increased by about 13%. This is all in real terms, okay? But the value of stock of natural capital per head declined by 40%. That's a huge disparity between the directions of movement of the three categories of assets. A world with a healthy biosphere could choose to draw down its natural capital and use ecosystem services to accumulate produced capital and human capital. That's a plausible scenario. And that is what economic development has come to mean among most economists. But that view and the practices it encourages has meant that in recent decades, humanity's demands have come to vastly outstrip nature's supply. It is the definition of unsustainable behavior.
So certainly this language resonates very strongly with the financial community, Partha. As you of course will realize, we're used to thinking in terms of assets and of risk and of commercial opportunity that arises from those risks, and of course the downside that can come too. Clearly the thinking that you're bringing in here and the thinking that is developing around natural world, natural capital, it has, dare I say it, almost revolutionary consequences for much of the world, because these factors have not been included in the discussion before, and because it so clearly implies that one of the problems to be overcome is also a lack of investment, both a lack of regard for the value of that asset, but also a lack of investment. And of course, finance is perfectly placed to help with that, if we can understand, if we can assess, and if we can manage those risks. And because the mismanagement of asset portfolios also implies opening ourselves up to risk, and those risks become material in several different ways for the finance sector through all the different product areas that we're dealing with. As the review demonstrates, and as we've heard about earlier from Helen Avery's panel discussion with regards to initiatives like TNFD. So in a way, one of the central problems is that nature's worth to society, or the value, the financial value of our natural assets, it's not reflected in market prices. It's not reflected in market thinking either. And I think maybe the thinking needs to come before the prices, but can you explain or help us to understand why this is and how we might particularly affect market thinking around the value of the assets that we're dealing with?
Thank you very much. These are, of course, exactly your observations are totally in line with the line we are taking in the review. There are three features of nature that make nature a very problematic asset in terms of economic thinking. One is that nature is always on the move. It's not like a building. You own a building, it stays put. But the wind blows, the rivers flow, oceans circulate, even continents drift. But of course, the time that it takes to drift is very slow, but it has powerful influence over time. So that's one, movement, and that makes property rights very hard to define, let alone enforce on those goods. Now, by property rights, I don't mean necessarily private rights, by the way. Could be community rights, could be state rights. A second feature of nature is that it's silent. Many of the processes are silent. What happens beneath our feet, you don't hear. And yet it's doing an enormous amount of work, which we enjoy the benefits from. A third is that it's invisible. Again, what happens in the soils, you don't observe, but the enormous amount of work is going on. It's like a factory churning out services for us. These three characteristics makes institutions, it makes it very hard for institutions. And it's not just markets. Even the state has difficulty coming to terms with natural capital. As a result, market prices certainly are zero. They're free goods for many, many of the services that we enjoy. I mean, regulating services. I mean, carbon sequestration, decomposition. These are incredible services that we enjoy silently, invisibly, and we don't have to pay for it. In fact, the irony is that governments subsidize the use of nature in a big way. And of course, that means we're paying a negative price. We're being paid to exploit nature. So we should recognize that there's an undervaluation of nature. And I should say it's not just the market's fault. States are also at fault. The only institution I know of which broadly speaking recognizes the value of nature are communities, small communities, which live on their local resource base because they can observe what's happening. And if communities have power to adjudicate the use of their local resource bases, threshing grounds, local forest, woodlands, water holes, then they do manage it. We've got lots of evidence of that from anthropologists' work in third world countries. But on the whole, we're rapacious in our use of nature because it comes for free.
Yes, that sounds familiar. The history of capitalism is one of excellent growth and reduction of poverty. It is also a history of exploitation in one form or another, as we are constantly reminded. And I really wonder what future generations will say about our use of natural resources as effectively a free asset. But it's for me, Partha, as a financier, I like to point out that actually financial services are a service. They're neither the prime mover in the very beginning, and they're very often not the solution either. But the services that we can provide love this language, and I think there's a huge willingness that I hear amongst investors and bankers to address this and to find the right solutions. I also hear a lot from companies, our major food companies, our major utilities, our major traders of commodities that want to get this right. But it has to be a global discussion, not a one-off, because as exactly as you say, individual governments need to be speaking the same language and not come from a different angle, because it immediately skews the competitive situation. So in that respect, this is a much more complicated discussion than climate. Climate, in a way, we focus on a single metric around carbon, and this, the energy revolution that is now happening in renewables is fantastic. We want to get to a similar situation with land deforestation, with land degradation, with the oceans and the like. Therefore, the language here about putting a value and putting a financial price on the resources that we're using, complex though it is, I'm absolutely certain it's the way forward. As your review says, one of the conclusions is that we are mismanaging our asset portfolios. And I wonder if we could move on to talking about how we find solutions to that. What are the ways in which academe and your study and the sense of the financial community are basically on side to find a solution? How can we work together with those to find, as we've just been discussing in the panel and before, the real solutions to valuing these assets correctly?
Well, it has to happen at various layers, and it has to happen in different various ways. First and foremost, we need to have something like a common grammar for understanding our place in nature. The fact that so much of nature is silent, invisible, and travels, and is, as a result, free, has made us think that there is no bounds on nature. We may recognize that the biosphere is finite, but we pride ourselves in our ingenuity to overcome that boundedness. We feel it's almost like a fisherman who goes fishing and knows he can take the fish away, home, cook it, eat it, dump it somewhere, and then comes back next day to fish some more. We are not external to the biosphere. We're embedded in it. We are part of the biosphere. And that perception, that idea that this is our home, will be the first step towards any change. Secondly, of course, you're quite right. I've been speaking with financiers, and particularly your own influence on the review has been enormous. I don't know if you have recognized that, because I think we think alike on these matters. And of course, you have right to be fearful of the future. You have a right to worry whether your supply chain is going to come crashing down because an entire ecosystem 5,000 miles away collapses. You need to have, if you're a financier here, you need to have some notion of what the state of the ecosystems is out there. The problem is, again, as I say, prices are not forthcoming. On the other hand, there are ways of managing assets without having to think about explicit prices. The quality management. You want to ensure that the biosphere is not hurt unduly by the transactions that you're taking, because at the end of the day, it poses risks to you if you don't care about how your activities are, how your portfolio is affecting the activities, portfolio choice. I think we need a combination of a cooperation between financiers, governments, and of course local communities, because that's so much of the economies of the first world, if you like, the rich countries, are built on the primary products of the poor world. And there needs to be a genuine cooperation with governments there, communities there, to ensure that the processes are not treating nature there as valueless. Okay. A third route, but there are many ways of attacking this problem. They have all to be done simultaneously. We need to describe our economies in the right way. We think of economic progress as income increases, but income is a flow. And when we look at income, say GDP, we look at the gross income. We don't look at net income. We don't take into account the fact that in raising income, you may be depreciating the assets on the basis of which your income is generated. So even if your GDP, a country's GDP increases, it could imply a sinking floor on which you're operating if you run down your assets. So we need to change the accounting system and move more towards company accounts. I mean, balance sheets. National accounts are not balance sheets. They're about income flows, income and expenditure flows. And of course, that hides a lot of stuff that's going on in the economy's transactions. So you have to worry about that. We have to bring these things together. A final point about, in response to you, is that investing in nature, it's important to recognize that investing in nature can mean doing nothing. We're not to interpret investment invariably as people, workers with hard hats, digging holes on the ground to lay tarmac. Planting a seed and leaving it alone with a little bit of nurturing maybe, but the nurturing part is minimal. It's the waiting part which is costly. So investment here, metaphorically would be wait, do not harm. Leaving alone a woodland is investing in that woodland because it'll look better next year. That's extremely important. And the value of that increase should be captured in your profitability calculations. And you need to be able to do that. If there were ideal prices, of course, it'll figure in. But even if there are no ideal prices on offer, the agreement between government, civil society, business, communities would ensure that that is protected. And we do that in various bits and pieces. We have protected zones, for example, in the oceans, on land. Why do we do that? Because we've implicitly given a price to it, a high price. Do not touch it. If you're in traditional societies, very often bits and pieces of nature, and I use the term not I'm using the term intentionally in economic terms, are regarded as sacred. Well, that's giving a huge value to that object. And preserving it is the equivalent of investing in it. Because if you don't preserve it, of course, it gets destroyed. So there are many ways of going about it. The one really good news, I think, in the post-COVID period is the fact that, as I say, the nurturing part of nature requires labor. It doesn't require machinery. It doesn't require chainsaws, just the reverse. You don't want to cut down the trees, you want to grow trees. So investment in nature is likely to be, and in fact there's a deal of evidence, is labor intensive. And that's good news. It means the employment issue is not, there's not going to be a trade-off between employment and nature, investment in nature. I think there are other aspects of the problem we could discuss, but I think a combination of these aspects of accounting, behavior, cooperation is what is needed for us to move forward.
Thank you. I think partly you've given a new meaning to the traditional phrase in asset management of passive investing, which I must say I find very attractive. Although when I think about my own garden and my own few trees, I have to be a bit more active than that. But I love the idea of letting them just grow, and I think the concept of passive investing applied to nature is absolutely excellent. Partha, I'm afraid our time is almost running up, but so I wanted to ask you just a word about the sense of urgency and how we instill that sense of urgency. We've had some fantastic media and film-related. We've had David Attenborough's wonderful witness statement, in which you also appeared, and I think to me, COVID has been a stimulus to this discussion. It's been a stimulus to the idea that we aren't in the right place in many of the ways that we're living, what we're wearing, what we're eating, how we're behaving. What's your feeling about the urgency that's required here? And are you, in the very end, are you optimistic that we will come through and succeed in restoring nature to where it should be?
That's a hard one to answer. The first part is easy. Yes, there is enormous urgency. A state of the environment reports that have been compiled over the past 2 decades, starting with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and more recently IPBES report on the state of the environment, they're very sobering reading. We have really trashed a good deal of Earth in the process of economic development as we have defined it in the past. So yes, there's no question about that. What can be done? Well, it really depends on us. We are not looking at a government problem. We're not looking at a problem of the market. We're looking at the fact that we, as citizens throughout the world, have been extremely negligent. Particularly, I can't speak for countries outside my own experience, but I do have data to show that what might be going through people's minds, which has resulted us into being here. The job is ours as citizens. The one great possibility that I see is the internet. We citizens we have access to people we have never met. So it's not just a question of going around within a neighborhood and complaining to the local authority. We can reach a much bigger audience. I think citizens, we need to think of ourselves as citizens when we think about nature. And as citizens, for collective security, we need to do something. And I would like that the review ends with a plea of two things. One, that the citizens ought to get together directly and indirectly to put pressure on all concerned, and including pressure on ourselves in our personal behavior. It's not just other people's problems. We ourselves are tarnished. We have to take selfie no matter where we go. We trash nature even as we do that. And the other thing we make a plea for in the review is education. We have to internalize our concerns because no institution can protect nature against the assault that we are capable of inflicting on it because of the three properties I mentioned. At the end of the day, we have to be judge and jury ourselves of our own behavior, not of others, obviously. And that can only happen, in my judgment, if you have some basic understanding of this infinitely beautiful object we call nature, the processes that are taking place, absolutely mysterious and amazingly beautiful if you just try and understand it a little bit. You don't have to be a deep ecologist. And if we are educated in nature studies from the earliest of our years and it doesn't disappear, then there is a chance that we will come to have an affection for nature, let alone awe. And I think at the end of the day, that will be the force that will be required because institutions can't do it on their own. We have to support the institutions by our own behavior.
Professor Partha Dasgupta, thank you very much indeed for those insights. I'm looking forward hugely to the response to the review, which will come out shortly. And I think that we are at the very beginning, I do believe we are at the beginning of a revolution in the way that we're thinking too about nature and how we use nature and how we value nature. And I'm convinced that the review that you have been responsible for will be a key part in that discussion. Thank you very much indeed for this, for your insights, and thank you very much indeed for this session at the Green.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure, as always, to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Josh Frydenberg, Treasurer of Australia. It's an honour to speak to you at the Green Horizon Summit. 2020 has been a very challenging year. COVID-19 has resulted in the most severe global economic crisis since the Great Depression. Across the world, hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs, and Australia's economy has not been immune. It has been hit hard. In response, our government has focused on skills and training, tax relief and infrastructure to support job creation. We are focused on the economic recovery from the impact of the pandemic, but also on building a stronger, more resilient country by tackling climate change and paving the way to a lower emissions future. I'd like to thank the Lord Mayor, William Russell, a great friend of Australia, for inviting me to speak and share Australia's experiences on tackling climate change as part of building a stronger economy, and in particular through sustainable financing. Mark Carney and others have done a tremendous job in highlighting the importance of mobilising private sector finance to support the transition already underway across the globe. Climate change is a truly international issue, requiring coordination and strong collaboration between the public and private sectors to unlock investment opportunities. We know that advancing the next generation of low emission technologies is crucial to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And realising these goals will require widespread cooperation, including active engagement with the private sector. Australia is playing its part by investing in innovative energy and infrastructure solutions domestically and by joining our global partners to ensure that climate finance is mobilised across the world. The Australian Government is backing new technologies that will create jobs, strengthen our economy and reduce emissions. And as we recover from COVID, Australia's technology-led approach will reduce the cost of new and emerging low-emission technologies. Australia's technology investment roadmap will accelerate the development and reduce the price of clean hydrogen, energy storage, low-emission steel and aluminium production, CO2 compression, hub transport and storage of CO2, as well as soil carbon. Getting these technologies right will open up new export opportunities and deliver jobs across the country while reducing our emissions. To support the Morrison government's technology investment roadmap, we have provided $1.4 billion to the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. ARENA, as it's known, seeks to improve the competitiveness of renewable energy technologies and increase the supply of renewable energy through innovation that benefits Australian consumers and businesses. Since 2012, ARENA has supported 566 projects with $1.6 billion in grant funding, unlocking a total investment of almost $6.7 billion in Australia's renewable energy industry. Once low or zero emissions technologies get close to cost parity with existing alternatives, we know, as we've seen with rooftop solar, that households and businesses will rapidly adopt those technologies. Of course, it's one thing to have the scientific and engineering expertise to build the technologies of the future, but it's another to finance their development. Working with the private sector to drive down the costs of key technologies is an important part of Australia's transition towards a lower emissions future. Australia is proud to be home to the world's largest publicly funded renewable financing entity, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or the CEFC as it is otherwise known. The CEFC has made investment commitments of more than $8 billion in new and emerging technologies through more than 160 different transactions and a further 13 co-financing arrangements, leading to investments in projects worth over $28 billion. The CEFC is a great example of what it means to mobilise private sector investment in opportunities that are economic but not yet easily bankable. For every dollar the CEFC invests, it mobilises more than $2 from other investors. Australia's success at being on the front line of renewable energy adoption has been a collaborative endeavour between government, the private sector and, most importantly, the Australian public. Since 2017, Australia has invested more than $30 billion in renewable energy, becoming the world leader in per capita deployment of solar and wind. 1 in 4 Australian households now have solar panels, and in 2019 alone, the share of wind and solar in Australia's electricity grids was more than double the global average, and is projected to rise even more rapidly in coming years. Australia is deploying new renewable energy 10 times faster per capita than the global average. And Australia has a history of meeting and beating our international climate emissions targets. We beat Kyoto by 128 million tonnes, and we have also clearly mapped out how we will meet our 2030 Paris target. We recognise that building resilience in the face of climate change is important in responding to natural disasters. And the bushfires we experienced in Australia earlier this year were devastating. We established a Royal Commission into national natural disaster arrangements and to ensure that we can improve our resilience and adapt to changing climatic conditions. We've invested over $15 billion in natural resource management, water infrastructure, drought and disaster resilience, and our overall recovery, which has included $325 million in further climate science and adaptation research and services. Australia is also focused on investing in climate finance to support countries in our region. We are a steadfast partner in building climate and disaster resilience, particularly in the Pacific, where climate change impacts livelihood, security, and the community's well-being. We will exceed our 2015 commitment of around $1 billion over 5 years by 2020 on climate development assistance, and pledged an additional $500 million over 5 years from 2020 for renewable energy, climate and disaster resilience in the Pacific. This includes $140 million for the Australian Mobilisation Climate Fund, which will mobilise investments in low emissions, climate resilient solutions for the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for your time and the invitation to join with you today. This has been a very important summit, and it's a privilege to be part of it.